Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what is the continuation of the celebration of St. Paul's Day. Last Sunday, we had the feast of the conversion of St. Paul and a very busy town hall meeting. So I thought it would be good to move this particular talk, which is about a journey, a pilgrimage that I made in May of 2011 with Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan, who are two very well-known biblical scholars. Dominic's an Irish ex-Catholic priest who is a lot of fun, and Marcus Borg was formerly a Lutheran minister, became a biblical scholar, and so they've collaborated for many years. And unfortunately, Marcus passed away in 2015, but it was a real honor to spend 2 weeks traveling with these very interesting scholars and a whole group of people from the UK and from America in Turkey. The original trip was supposed to start in Damascus in Syria. And it was just before, I remember we got our visas, we were all set to go, and right at the last minute, they had to change it because the beginning of what we now know was the Syrian civil war was about to explode. And so we kind of watched that sad unraveling of that part of the world. And we now know that something like 5.5 million Syrians are now refugees, living 3 million in Turkey and all over the Middle East and in Europe. And a lot of the migration problem from that region came about then. So we started off in Turkey, and I just want to, what I'm going to be doing is kind of showing some slides and some pictures of what we experienced. The top photograph, the middle, is Dominic Crossan, and the lower photograph is Marcus Borg. And so the trip was designed, we would spend the day visiting these different sites that were associated with St. Paul's travels. And then in the evening, we would have a lecture from sometimes from both of our leaders talking about what we had seen and then preparing us for what we were going to be seeing next day. These are some of the cities and communities that we visited. You recognize many of them from the Old Testament. Some of them, like Colossae, was just a pile of dirt. There wasn't anything there. This area is full of earthquakes and instability, political and geographic instability. But it was really very interesting. For me, it was really interesting for these places that we're so familiar with to come alive, and for these biblical scholars to help us to kind of put Paul in a different context and to interpret the different ways that the gospel began to be imagined by someone like St. Paul. This is a map of the region, and I just wanted to sort of point out there, this area, Antioch here, Antioch on Avrantes, it's now known as Antakya, Queen of the East. It wasn't on our schedule, but it is a very important part. It's the third largest city in the Roman Empire after Rome and Alexandria. It's on the main route, as you see, between Syria and the Middle East. And there was a very wealthy Antiochine Jewish community that Paul would have absolutely been associated with. They were exempt from military service and worship of the emperor, which again is going to be something very important in this presentation. Strong Jewish Christian roots through what became known as the God-fearers. The God-fearers were Gentiles who loved the moral framework of the Jewish community and their close family connections and their business associations. So you had a very interesting group of kind of in-between people that we term God-fearers. And it's this group that Paul is most attracted to, most intrigued by. And there's a kind of misinformation that Paul was out to convert. He became a Christian, and then he's out to convert Jews to become Christians. And that's just not true, as you will discover as we continue on this journey. It was the God-fearers, the Gentiles that loved the shape of Judaism And so Paul liberates them from having to observe the Jewish law or to become circumcised to become Jews. And obviously he gets in trouble around that. So this area is very significant in his understanding of what the good news would mean to a larger part of the world. There was a lot of wealth in this city. It was the seat of the governor of Syria. Financial support came from the Jerusalem, came to the Jerusalem church from this area. There is a deacon known as Nicholas of Antioch, who was one of 7 deacons chosen by Jerusalem to provide for the common fund. And there was a very wealthy Jewish community there as well. And much of the financing of his extensive missionary journeys came from this community. So we didn't go there, but we started our journey in Anatolia, which is here, which is right on the ocean. And we kind of went up and then turned towards Ephesus. So the area we explored was this area, looking at many of those sites that Paul was associated with. You'll see here Colossae, Laodicea, Ephesus is here, Miletus. And so our concentration was kind of up around here. And we travel by coach. And as I say, we stayed in nice hotels. And I'd been to Turkey twice before, so I was familiar with other sites and Greece associated with Paul. But I was really interested in the perspective from Borg and Crossan. And here's a couple of their books. Some of you know these books. I've certainly referred to them in a number of my sermons. And they would just talk about different aspects of the New Testament through these particular themes. And one of the major themes that I learned was that you only understand Paul if you understand the context of the Roman Empire, the way society worked, the way authority, the way particularly the deification of the state and the deification of the emperor. So the context into which Jesus and Paul is born is that Rome was the most important power on the planet. It ruled the world. It was the place from which early Christianity would grow. And the empire stretched from Spain in the west, Britain in the north, the Euphrates in the east, and into North Africa in the south. And then this whole idea that imperial theology, we sometimes we can't get our heads around this idea of worshiping the state. But we've got lots of nationalists in America who kind of worship the state and the flag and all that America stands for, and we are the current imperial power in the world. So we might be blind again to the way in which we think about power and deity and how we think of ourselves maybe more important than others and how we share that around the world. And this was also kind of going on at the time of Paul in Rome. Caesar Augustus, the greatest of the emperors, was seen as divine. His original name, Octavian, he was born around 63 BCE. He ruled as emperor from 31 to 14 CE. And some of the titles that were given to the emperor were God, Son of God, Lord, Savior of the world, the person who is responsible for bringing peace on earth. And we recognize many of these themes because Paul uses them a lot in his teachings and how he describes Jesus. And it was seen the emperor was the product of a divine conception conceived in his mother by the god Apollo, god of light, reason, and order. And one of the ways that this imperial theology was expressed was through the decorations on these fabulous, gorgeous temples and buildings. And it was also interesting when we would travel with Borg and Crossan, they would return to a place they hadn't been for a couple of years. And here they're looking at some recently excavated lintel from some temple where, again, the Son of God, Augustus, is seen as this great, powerful leader, and they were very excited to kind of find this new thing. So Augustus was the person who brings peace on earth through military victory. At the Battle of Actium, he ends the decades-long civil war that had torn the empire apart. And now this Pax Romana was reigning through military victory and sustained by Roman imperial power. And many of the routes between these imperial cities, they were often a garrison of troops, and the roads were open for trade, but also that the military could get from one place to another to keep this peace, to enforce this peace, often by violence. And so all of this, according to Roman imperial theology, was the will of God, and it was omnipresent in the public media of the day, and all these images of buildings and inscriptions, and even on the coinage. So this is the historical context that we understand Paul. And so the titles for Jesus, Son of God, Lord, Savior of the world, the one who brings peace on earth, existed before he was born. They were all titles of the emperor. And so when Paul and other early Christians applied these titles to Jesus, they were saying Jesus is Lord and the empire is not. So the difference between these two lordships, and according to the 7 letters of Paul that were written in the early 50s, and thus earlier than the Gospels, that Rome embodied peace through victory, and Jesus proclaims peace through justice and nonviolence. So Paul and other early Christians created communities radically centered in God that embodied a vision of life together that was very different from the vision embodied in this Roman imperial theology. One of the things that we prayed together, it wasn't just a kind of historical, cultural tour, but it was very much a pilgrimage. And I love this, this image that Marcus Board gave us of what our journey together was like. He said, pilgrimage is about a quest for understanding and meaning, and not just about seeing other parts of the world. In its fullest meaning, pilgrimage is about a date with God and the sacred. So we began in Antalya, this very beautiful Turkey city. You see the top photograph, some of the architecture of the region. And it's a place where Paul arrives. He's recently pulled into missionary work by Barnabas, and he's accompanied by John Mark. And then he later breaks up with Barnabas, and we don't quite know what that falling out was about, but Paul begins his own missionary work, and he travels to many of the places by foot, often long journeys. Something like 2,000 kilometers that he and Barnabas would have done together on his journey. So you get a sense of the enormous ground that Paul covered and kind of the hardships that he would have gone through. And then he has this kind of love-hate relationship with the mother church in Jerusalem, and supports it throughout his travels and his ministry. So here's some of the beautiful architecture and items that we often would see in some of the museums that we would visit. Sagalassos was a military post. It would have been one of those smaller communities between the larger cities linked by the roads. You see in the bottom photograph, it was strategically placed so the garrison could see the surrounding country and could protect the land. Much of this region was actually settled by veterans. So you would have had military achievement and honors that were given, and often land and positions were given to former military veterans. And so this was a Roman colony in the middle of Asia Minor. And so Paul would have gone to these communities, traveled by foot, and then he would have built relationships with the Jewish community and those God-fearers. And there were often, we would see the ruins of beautiful synagogues that Paul probably would have been familiar with and met with. So this is Sagalassos. Perge, we know that Paul, John, Mark, and Barnabas arrived here on the first missionary journey from Antioch on the Orontes and from Cyprus. It was a city of great prosperity in Roman times. There's a southern gate, wide terrace streets that you see, and the Palastra was dedicated to the Emperor Claudius. The most famous sanctuary in Paul's time was the Temple of Artemis in Pergae, and Paul preached there, but we heard that he had little success because of growing opposition to his message. Antioch is a kind of well-known name, but this is Pisidian Antioch, and you see another shrine to the emperor. Again, this was a way in which the local community expressed their national identity, and these were huge monuments, beautiful carvings, and so anybody, you get a scale of this, anybody who would be coming to these cities would see the statues of the emperor as a god and would offer sacrifices and would just, be really a part of this kind of national connection. Hierapolis is an extraordinary ruined city. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but you get a sense of these beautiful pools, cascading pools. This area B here was, and you can still go there and you see the forum, you see these beautiful streets and shops. And so these cities, Paul would have gone there. He was himself a tent maker. He would have had his tools. He would have gone there and worked among the ordinary people. Many of the buildings where the poor lived, the ground floor would have had a shop with an open space, and then tenement housing above it. So these cities would have been the places where Paul would have gotten to know, largely through the Jewish community, gotten to know people, and he would have preached. This is, there's a very large cemetery here, memorials to the dead. Here you get a sense of these wonderful white limestone pools that Hierapolis. Beautiful scenery. This is just one of the roads coming out of the city. I talked a little bit about, we all know the St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, and this hill that we all walked up, this is the ruin of the city of Colossae. There's nothing there, basically. We climbed on the top. And so what Turkey has been doing is spending a lot of money investing in roads, infrastructure, airports, and then excavating these cities and trying to help tourism, particularly the uncovering of sacred sites. This is, at one point, this would have been buried, but this is an example of what Turkey is doing in uncovering and kind of reconstructing and interpreting many of these sites. Laodicea is mentioned as one of the churches in the book of Revelation. It's one of the 7 churches. The woolen industry was thriving here. It was a city where, again, a very strong Jewish presence. It was a city chosen because it was on the main trade routes and military routes. And it was also an area where they had major earthquakes. So many of these cities would fall down and maybe be rebuilt, or like Colossae, not. The jewel, I mean, this everybody knows this picture of this library. Ephesus is extraordinary. It was once a city with 200,000 people, a very large port. Most of Ephesus is still buried. You get a picture here of this. It's very busy, lots of tourists, and these beautiful streets and the shops and the houses and so on. And there's something like 1/8 of the city that has been uncovered. Because of silting and earthquakes, the port is something like six or 7 miles away from where it originally would have been. So it's kind of inland now. And but you get this imperial, again, this worship of the state through the emperor. You get a sense of how extraordinary all of this would have been. And Paul spent many years here. He spent some time in prison here. And this is an example of, they've actually through sponsorship, I think it was a German banking support, that they were able to put this roof on and then dig out these gorgeous houses. You see how beautifully and how ornate they were. This house is a shrine to Mary. It is seen as the place where the mother of Jesus lived, and so it is a shrine that is honored both by the Christian community and the Muslim community. One of the fun trips near Ephesus, this is a place that the public doesn't usually see. It is the cave of St. Thecla, and we had to climb up this hill, and the cave had a big lock on it and bars and everything. But we got inside, and this is the probably the oldest image that survives of St. Paul. And Thecla was a teenager who heard Paul preach, and she was a little rebel. We heard that she had her hair cut short, and she didn't want to get married, and so she went off and became a disciple of Paul's. And we can interpret that however we like today, those of us with teenagers or grandchildren. But she was her own person, and she found in this gospel a way that she could be who she wanted to be. And so this is a cave that is dedicated to her name. There is Paul preaching, and I think that's either her mother or the patroness of the shrine. So we're still in Ephesus. You get the museum here was full of really, really fascinating remnants of the past. As I say, Paul would have lived here 3 years. Only a small percentage of the city has been uncovered. Many of the civic and administrative buildings and the religious sanctuaries are still kind of in place. There's a great amphitheater, and the central cult of Ephesus was the cult of Artemis. And there are 3 magnificent statues, and you see the statue. And if you remember from the book of Acts, it was the silversmiths in Ephesus that had a hard time with Paul, because he was basically preaching against the worship of these gods of wood and stone and silver. And he was talking about another god. And so the silversmiths, who would have created the shrines in Ephesus, saw this as a threat to their business. And so they complained about him and wanted him put in prison or kicked out of town. The impressive library of Celsus was built on the site of a temple of Artemis. And the Roman goddess Diana, the goddess of chastity, the hunt and earth mother, was worshipped there. And Paul would have lectured here as one of the visiting philosophers in the hall of Tyrannus, where he was rejected when he was rejected from the synagogue. And we know that he rented the hall between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. when the workers would have returned to work. So he would have continued his tent making, his awning making as a profession here. And he would have paid probably a secretary or a messenger to write, deliver, and read his letters. For instance, to the Corinthians, he hired Timothy as his secretary. And he would have been imprisoned here. He talks about fighting with wild beasts in Ephesus, maybe a metaphor given. It was one of the Ephesian leaders who reported to the authorities his unlawful welcome of a Gentile into the Jerusalem temple precincts, which is kind of the beginnings of the end for Paul, because of that incident where a non-Jew, a Gentile, he invited into the non-Gentile part of the temple. And it was an Ephesian who kind of reports him to the authorities. And this is the beginning of Paul getting in trouble and having to be sent to Rome, where he is finally he's executed for this terrible crime. Paul would have visited Corinth and Philippi from here. And again, these are other sites and temples that we would have seen, just extraordinarily beautiful. And one of the things that Borg and Crossan talked about is a way in which that through art, the cult of domination, the way in which for instance, the image on the down here is that often Roman military power was seen in these big statues. And this is obviously a goddess blessing the emperor, but you would have had these statues of domination. And the Celts, the Galatians, this whole region was the original source of the Galatians. So Paul's letter to the Galatians. And the Galatians were hated and feared by the Romans because they had the audacity to fight against them, in the same way that the Jews had the audacity to fight against the Roman Empire. And so in statuary, the Romans were often, very larger than the Galatian and the Celts. So a way in which you have the whole frieze here that tells the story of the domination of Rome. This was a very interesting lintel from a synagogue that showed a very powerful woman who was a donor to this synagogue. And it showed that the power of women, and particularly wealthy women, to bless ministries and movements. Even, we know that Paul, his first baptism of Lydia, Lydia is a wealthy woman. She made her money through dyeing purple, or the color purple, which was used for, very top-notch, high-class senators and emperors wore purple. And so Lydia would have been the first Christian baptized in Macedonia. So we talked about the way in which these God-fearers were very influential people, often with a lot of means, and were very much welcomed in the center of civic life. And again, this is a statue to one of those women. And this statue would have been part. So a way in which these civic buildings not only shared the role of the emperor and the power of Rome, but also benefactors from the community would have been honored with these buildings as well. This is another visit to Sardis, and again, a very important city in the journey of Paul. And you can see some of the wonderful buildings that we would have seen then. We visited a synagogue, beautiful mosaics. Again, it shows you the wealth and the power. This would have been a synagogue that Paul might have actually visited. And here you can see the area where the scrolls would have been read from. You can see some of the beauty of the interior of this synagogue. And in many ways, you can see how as the churches began to evolve and have places where Christians would meet, how the synagogue tradition influenced the way that we think of sacred space. Miletus, originally a port, now again silted in, would have been a place that Paul, we know he visited there. It was conquered by Alexander the Great because of its port and its proximity to trade routes. And Miletus used to sit on the ocean. It's now 7 kilometers from the shore because of the silting. And we were sitting there actually, this is the place where Paul knows his end is near. He's about to be tried in Rome. And so he says his farewell to his community here. And so there was this is kind of the place where we ended our visit. Kudasi is a modern Roman, it's a modern Turkish city, right, very beautiful on the beach. So we stayed there for a bit. And this gives you an idea of some of I was talking earlier about how Turkey is certainly, 10 years ago, was really investing. This was a brand new airport near Ephesus that has been built. And again, Turkish life. I found the Turkish people in all three of my visits just very warm and welcoming. A lot has changed in Turkey in the last 10 years. President Erdogan came into power in 2014. Some people would say it's very authoritarian. There was a clampdown, there was a coup by the military. And so Turkey today, as a compared to 10 years ago, it was much safer and much more kind of conducive to this kind of travel than it is today. You get a sense of some of the architecture and ways in which Turkey is kind of welcoming the world. One of the things you'll find there, though, it's interesting because Paul is so important to the Christian community. He's not that important to the Turkish community. I drove down on another visit. I went to Tarsus in the south. It's actually not far from the Antioch, that starting place. And the only places I found associated with Paul was this church. There's a church that's named after St. Paul. And you get a sense of this was a kind of a cave church that was very old, but not much. When you go to Tarsus, there's not much about this man. And one of the reasons I think is because Paul is not considered a prophet. And in Islam, Jesus and Mary are given great honor, but just Paul is not mentioned at all. And I think it's because they don't really get or honor what a prophet or what an apostle is. And so I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in helping Turkey understand why Paul is so important. Many of the World Heritage sites, I did a lot of work with the World Heritage community, and that's a whole other conversation. But Paul is associated with Athens. We know that he preached there. There is a public space called the Bema, which would have been a place where the philosophers and the preachers of the day, and it's still there. When you go to Athens at the foot of the Acropolis, there's this area known as the Bema. So Paul is associated with Athens. Of course, he's associated with Rome. There's a beautiful basilica, St. Paul's outside the walls, where his remains are allegedly were found about 300 years after his death. Ephesus, of course, Hierapolis, and other sites that we just talked about. But one of the things that the World Heritage community is very interested in is how international sites could link different countries, often those countries in conflict, how those sites could be used to bring people together. And one of the ideas that I had early on was, and I formed this foundation called the St. Paul's Foundation for International Reconciliation, was how the sites of Paul could be linked in sharing history and traditions about Paul, and with the major outstanding value. To become a World Heritage Site, there has to be what they call a major outstanding value. And for Paul, I think the outstanding value is reconciliation. And how could reconciliation be used? We know that there's conflict between Turkey and Greece. There's conflict, here's Thessaloniki. There's conflict between Greece and Macedonia. Paul has this dream, if you remember the dream, where a Macedonian appears to him. And so Paul goes from Asia as a result of that vision, and he moves into Macedonia, ancient Macedonia, and Christianity is taken then to Europe. And one of I visited Thessalonica is a fabulous, wonderful city that is associated with Paul. And he arrived at this little place called Kavala. And there's a little church there now called St. Nicholas. And this is where Paul arrives by boat, and he meets Lydia. I told the story of Lydia. She is the first baptized European. And he brings this non-imperial theology to this part of the world. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done. The Orthodox community, here's some examples of This is actually a Macedonian icon that was painted by a friend of mine, and a Macedonian dome that is part of a thermal baths that is in this part of the world. But just splendid architecture and history. So Paul would have founded the church in Greece and the church in Macedonia. This is a World Heritage Site. It's Lake Ohrid. These are three nuns that were praying by the lake, and some of the churches from that part of the world. And again, I just learned so much about what Paul, when you see him in this kind of context, what I learned on the trip was the importance of context, how the imperial church is in many ways still with us, what the message of Paul would have sounded like to those communities as he was going around from town to town, and he would have been rejected, and then how he would have continued to do what he could, and what the techniques might have been of Paul to evangelize, what they would have looked like. And also, what was interesting about listening to Borg and Crossan, how the Christian right, in many ways, just has the whole Pauline thing wrong, and from that has the whole Christian thing wrong. And so their work, I mean, one of the things I found out that their mission was really to save Christianity as a kind of intelligent, creative, loving, kind of more than political, something that transcends and brings people together, and kind of to save it from the kind of rabid fundamentalism that we're experiencing right now. And the importance of reconciliation. I mean, you could see that Paul was bringing together different communities, and as the world, as the empire was expanding and the diversity of the community, eventually that message, instead of being rejected by imperial theology, it took 300-400 years, and that message became the central message that actually would hold the empire together. I remember there was a phrase that I don't know if it was Martin Luther King talked about. Your neighbor is the person who is blocking you on the road to where you see yourself going. Your neighbor, like the Good Samaritan, is that person who's blocking your journey. And I created this foundation, St. Paul's Foundation, that was supposed to be helping to look at the sites of Paul as a World Heritage, International World Heritage Site. And about a year after the creation of the foundation, I met this Ugandan bishop, Bishop Christopher Sanyonyo. He was educated at Hartford College and Union Seminary, and went back, became a bishop of a diocese in Uganda. I knew Bishop, his boss, the Archbishop Okoth, used to talk about him. He was always kind of a bit of a rebel, but when he retired, he was the only bishop to say, God created gay and lesbian people. And at a time in Uganda when the anti-gay laws were being kind of ramped up, and gays were put in prison, and people wanted to apply the death sentence, Bishop Christopher, in retirement, he was in his 70s, was standing up and saying, no, I think gay people are part of God's creation, and we shouldn't persecute them. And so he was alienated from the Church of Uganda and persecuted. And he wrote a letter to the Church of Uganda, basically trying to state why he was living and believing what he was doing and welcoming gay and lesbian people. And he wrote to them, St. Paul is my mentor. And in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, bond or free. We're all one in Christ. And so I ended up spending the next 7 years working with Bishop Christopher, and the St. Paul's Foundation. Actually, instead of doing the work of linking these sites together, we took the theology of Paul, this radical theology of inclusion. And just as Christopher was persecuted for his inclusiveness, I had a different understanding of this kind of non-imperial inclusive theology, what that meant like. This is a photograph of Bishop Christopher at the grave of David Cato Cato was murdered, we think, by the government, certainly people who did not want the gay and lesbian movement in Uganda to thrive, but he was brutally murdered, and Bishop Christopher took the funeral. At the funeral, the Church of Uganda lay people, they wouldn't give him a proper church burial. And the lay people started ranting and using Paul's theology badly about homosexuality, and they used it to beat up on gay people. And Bishop Christopher stepped in to do his funeral. We started a center in Kampala. This is a group of people that I worked with, and we got money from the Elton John Foundation, USAID. And so the St. Paul's Reconciliation and Equality Center was set up to do ministry and build the bridges between gay and straight people. So that was an example of kind of how do we interpret Pauline theology in context in the world today. So, anti-imperialist. He was not a Christian. The term had not been invented. He was a Jewish mystic. And he changed from that kind of fundamentalist, violent, to being a nonviolent, inclusive person. And he becomes very interested in these in-between people that we term the God-fearers. And that inclusive welcome is to everyone. And he also, like the Pharisees, when the temple was destroyed, and many of the traditions of the Jewish community in AD 70 the Pharisees allowed Judaism to continue in a different form without the temple. And so we owe a lot to the Pharisees, the tradition that Paul was from. And so he did that. He took on the Pharisaic tradition of taking these older traditions and wrapping them in new packaging and surviving. And so that's what he was doing when he was going around preaching. So we might think today, what does that mean for this community, this congregation, named in honor of St. Paul? How do some of these values, anti-nationalist, anti-imperialist, the worship of the state, the building of relationships between other faiths, how does that look for us as disciples of Jesus and influenced by Paul? Who are the in-between people today? And how do we take these older traditions and wrap them in new and exciting ways to communicate, and also continue, as Borg and Crossan did, to put these messages in context and to interpret them, to interpret scripture, not to weaponize it, but to interpret it in a way that can help us in our spiritual journey. Thank you for journeying with me in the steps of Paul.